Good afternoon or good evening. I think it's good evening. First, I wanted to applaud all of you for being here. I know this is the last session of the day, and we will promise to be done on time or early, because we're probably standing between you and drinks, I'm guessing. So, with that as a backdrop, welcome to Ops Transformation 5215. This session is about organizing for cloud operations, challenges and lessons learned. We started cloud operations within VMware probably a year to a year and a half ago. So at that time, we were chartered with developing the people and process aspect to add value to our technology. Technology has become probably the easier side of the equation to implement as you're talking about cloud, software defined data center, or hybrid cloud. What Gartner found, and certainly what we have found through experience, is the far greater challenge now is how to operate, how to operationalize that technology once it's in place. So that is our team's charter, is to work on what are the people considerations, the organizational considerations, the process considerations, very VMware-centrically, of course, because what we do is tied to very closely to our management products. But what we are doing is pretty new to VMware, namely addressing the people and the process aspect of this. So we created about a year and a half ago, an operating model. And then we've been fortunate enough for the last year plus to be working with customers to implement this operating model. So this presentation is intended to provide to you some of our lessons learned, what some of the challenges we saw and continue to see, and how customers have overcome those challenges in organizing specifically for cloud operations. And I say cloud operations, but you could very easily replace the word cloud up there with software-defined data center or hybrid cloud operations. So with that, I just want to ask first, how many of you have a cloud implemented in your environment? Okay, good. How many of you are experiencing challenges in operating that environment? Okay. Good, thank you. My name's Kevin Lees. I'm a principal architect at VMware. And as I said before, I have basically responsibility for this team from a strategy and a technical perspective for how we address organizational, people, and process considerations, as well as how we apply VMware management tool stack to enable those process changes, which in turn cause role changes and skill set changes, and, as we have found, a need for organizational changes. And my colleague?
I'm Colette, Hakim, an operations architect within the same team, and we are primarily focused on creating and innovating the people and process side of the house, VMware assets to help and support our customers and clients to smoothen their technology deployments and ensure that they will achieve the operational excellence.
So what we're going to cover and what we hope the key takeaways are from this are that business as usual in the case of cloud, software-defined data center, the new way that IT operates going further has changed. Would anybody disagree with that? Does anybody think that you can just keep doing things the way you've always done it with cloud, software-defined data center, hybrid cloud, and everything will be just fine? Anybody believe that to be the case? Okay, that's what I would have hoped to have seen. Thank you. Otherwise, we were just going to end the presentation right now. Secondly, that transforming, undertaking this journey does yield real results. Thirdly, that transforming includes changing the operating model. And lastly, there are impacts, there are challenges, but they can be overcome. And we've seen many customers to this point overcome those challenges. So what I want to start with is transforming involves changing the operating model. I'm going to cover this section which sets things up, and Colette will take over from there. We had a bet before this as to how many people would show up, and Colette lost, so he gets to do the bulk of the presentation. I get to sit back. First of all, operations transformation during the cloud area. And again, when you see cloud, replace it with software-defined data center, hybrid cloud, and it all still applies, as we have found out. On the left-hand side, this represents just some of the new capabilities provided by these new technologies. What it does, though, is it acts as a forcing function for making changes across these vertical areas that you see on the right-hand side of the slide. Implementing these capabilities or taking advantage of these capabilities has a direct impact on the people aspect, the process aspect, the organizational aspect, how you govern within IT, as well as how you manage IT from a financial perspective going forward. So cloud, software-defined data center, hybrid cloud acts as a forcing function for making these changes. I don't want to date myself, but I've been in the industry for over 30 years, and from my perspective, this really is the first time that I've experienced in my professional career a technology that is sufficiently disruptive to truly cause changes across those verticals. From the perspective of yielding real results, I believe there was another, and I don't have the title or the number for the particular presentation, but there was a presentation during VMworld that addressed this in a lot more detail. But VMware undertook a cloud journey benchmark study in the first half of 2013. That involved reaching out to both VMware customers and non-VMware customers. So this wasn't a VMware-centric study, if you will. We got a lot of great results from that reinforced what we were seeing qualitatively and provided us with quantitative data to back up what we were seeing. This particular slide I liked, so I included it, and what this shows is that the amount of transformation that's undertaken, there's a direct relationship between that and the return on investment that's realized by the IT organization undertaking that transformation journey. I think there was about 250 respondents to this survey, so it was a fairly substantial number. I don't know about statistically valid from a theoretical perspective, but certainly as big as any of the studies I've seen from Gartner, for instance. So we take the results of these studies very seriously. And again, what we found is that undertaking this transformation journey, the more you do, the better it is, the higher the return on the investment for undertaking it. From an operating model perspective, this is just a very high-level view of the operating model that we arrived at as it's impacted by implementation of cloud, software-defined data center, hybrid cloud from an operational perspective. From an organizational perspective, there's two primary points. One is that IT must become service-oriented. They must start acting as a service provider, just like the large service providers out there that are offering public services, public cloud services. IT needs to start acting in the same way. And that will set them up also to act as a service broker, which is going to become increasingly important over time. Secondly, IT needs to be more integrated. So those silos that have grown up in traditional IT have to break down. That communication barrier will be a death knell to being able to operate a cloud environment, a software-defined data center environment, a hybrid cloud environment, because of the sheer rate of change that will be experienced in those environments. And that's what we're going to focus the bulk of this presentation on, is that organizational aspect. From an operational perspective, real quickly, the things that we found to be most critical were a standardized, and continue to be, a standardized self-service catalog, extensive automation, and that's both from a provisioning perspective as well as a remediation perspective. So automating end-to-end your provisioning process for workloads that end users deploy into the environment is probably the first place to start from our experience. That's where you will gain the highest value the fastest, is by automating the provisioning process. But also from an operations perspective, looking at how you can automate remediation. What are those tasks within operations that you know have to occur if a certain event happens? You know, unfortunately, that this, for whatever reason, virtual machine has to be rebooted. There's no reason not to just automate that as a result of some trigger within something like VC Operations Manager. Thirdly, and one of my favorites, policy-based control. Moving more towards a policy-based, policy-driven IT, if you will. That applies to provisioning. That applies to configuration and compliance. So taking more of a policy-based approach is a way to reinstill IT governance in these types of environments. How many of you have experienced the shadow IT effect, where you have business users bypassing IT and going directly to external providers? Anybody? Yeah, okay. Quite a few. From our perspective, there's a couple of ways to bring them back in so that you can continue to apply your IT governance. One is around service level agreements, which is something that these service providers, whose names will remain anonymous, don't typically provide to the business users in the same way that they need them from IT. And secondly is by taking this policy-based approach so that the end user can simply select the service they want to deploy from the catalog, and it automatically gets provisioned to the proper place, whether that be internally or externally, perhaps dependent on the service level agreement that they choose, or some compliance that's known to be, needs to be associated with that particular service they're deploying. So all of that can be hidden from the end user. They shouldn't know nor care, and typically don't, where it's actually going to end up, as long as it meets the quality of service that they need and provides the service that they're asking for. The third area is proactive integrated operations. So moving from a mentality of the break-fix mentality, which is what I'm used to seeing from when I ran operations, to one that is much more proactive, where you're doing everything you can to determine if there is some potential issue that could occur that might be service disrupting, being able to troubleshoot that, arrive at a root cause and fix it before an end user makes a call to the service desk or the network operations center sees it through their monitoring tools. And there's a lot more detail around this. I'm just trying to hit the high points. And lastly, around financial management and measurement, being much more transparent back to the businesses as to what it costs for them to run their services in these environments. You don't have to necessarily charge them for it, but at least show back, or the term that we're starting to like to use more, shame back to the end user organizations, so they can really see what it's costing them to run their services in these environments. And what we have found is there's a natural governing effect by doing that, where they will actually become more conscious of what they're doing and will be more conscious about shutting off workloads that they no longer need. So that's something that we've seen directly when customers have implemented chargeback or even showback. And also measurement. Benchmarking is becoming increasingly important in this environment. So really understanding where you are and how you are working in comparison to others in the industry. Also from a high level, and this is more of what Colette will dive into, so I won't spend a lot of time on this. But this really represents our organizational model, if you will, in this operating model. So what we have is the concept of cloud infrastructure operations and cloud tenant operations. Now we show them physically separated. They don't have to be. They can, but it can be logical with no problem whatsoever. We've had customers implement it that way within the same team. But really the point here is the whole reason for having cloud tenant operations is to really instantiate that idea of having a service-oriented mindset. So as you see from all the various arrows going into and coming out of cloud tenant operations, that becomes the primary point of contact to the outside world, if you will, outside of IT. They're interacting with the lines of business. They become, over time, the first point of contact from a network operations center or a service desk. As you become more proactive, there should be fewer calls coming in. That's one of the KPIs we actually recommend. But when calls do come in, it's probably going to be, I have this service and it's not working. I don't know why. So the first place that the NOC and service desk should go going forward is to tenant operations. They will act as the first point of triage because they are responsible for services. They will then in turn bring in infrastructure ops if needed, or application development if needed, if it turns out that it's within the application. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Colette to dive into that a little bit further.
Thanks, Kevin. So this section is going to be focused more on some of the lessons that we learned throughout the implementations of the organization transformation, some of the stories. Hopefully that will be some sort of examples and things that will definitely be on the right track for you to learn of and get the benefit that you expect. So the first thing that I would like to start with is a blast from the past. IT used to be in the client-server world delivering services or technology-driven services. And typically it used to be the case where we have like an infrastructure team, database team, application team, you name it. And those various teams sit in like silos or siloed environments, and everyone at the end of the day wanted to reach out to the business and deliver the commitments and the services the business expects. So historically speaking, there are still many service delivery models being used, and I would like to start up with the first one. This role typically is the business analyst role, the middleman role, and the business analyst role is, you can think of him or her as the translator between, or the liaison with the business, between IT and business. And what this role is responsible for is basically the translation of the business requirements into IT and the full coordination and centralization of requests and having those submitted to, let's say, an IT architect to go through them and go through their needs, performance needs, capacity needs, SLA targets, etc. And they end up with a real defined solution based on these requirements that the service developers or IT application developers need to tailor for the business requirements or to meet the business requirements. That is a kind of hard role because in some IT organizations we've seen this role reporting to the business and dotted line into the IT. And some organizations we've seen this role part of the IT but dotted line to business. And playing the role of translator all the time, sometimes it's hard to keep up to speed with the constant changing requirements and needs of the business. So it requires some sort of special skills for the business IT analysts. Also, we have seen IT receiving requests directly without that middleman role from the business through, for example, a service request process in place. So they reach out to the service desk, we need this, we need 1, 2, 3, and they go through the process. Now, how many of you have got the service request process? Okay. How many of you think that business users are not following the service request process? So that's one of the challenges, is that this process is not being followed all the time, like bypassing, I know X person in the application development, call him directly, state what the requirements are, and state what the concerns are, and go from there. And maybe after a couple of days or weeks, log the request into the system, or go through the process. So what do you expect IT is ending up with? A mountain or piles of requests by the end of the day, where automation is definitely needed to speed up things and make the IT service delivery more efficient story. Also, we got a combination between 1 and 2. So there is a middleman role, and also there is a request fulfillment kind of process in place, but still it's hard sometimes to keep up with the constant changing requirements of the business, and therefore you would see the cowboy style. I'm from Texas, so this is pretty much common in Texas. The cowboy style simply is the ROG user style, where business departments or line of businesses have their own little ITs. So let's say we're waiting for our IT organization to come up with a solution for X. We've seen a similar solution offered for a cheaper price at, say, Amazon or X service cloud provider. Let's go and subscribe, and you don't have to deal with our IT organization. How many of you have the shadow IT? Yes. And the reason, there are a couple of reasons, and one of them is that IT is not up to speed to the fulfillment process, and sometimes it's even more expensive to provision the services through the local IT. Well, we're not saying that IT should be the service provider for every single service. And that's why you hear IT being positioned as a service broker, because it's not sometimes wise to maintain everything locally in your IT, and simply if you subscribe to a service and make it available to end users and consumers, that could be more effective and efficient. So with all of these, can you imagine the picture once you get into the cloud, and the problems that you're facing today are becoming even more compounded when you move into the cloud era? All the operational challenges will be just multiplied by a factor. Why? Because one of the promises of being in a cloud, the elasticity, the agility, being up to speed, and those cannot be fully achieved without being or having certain processes in place, and more effective processes, I would say. I always use this example: garbage in, garbage out. How would you automate something that has not been engineered well in the first place? You use the tool to show more efficiency in the way that you operate. So if you automate a broken process, what do you expect the results be? So a key component to move from the client-server world into the new private cloud world would be, how would we team up? How would we form our, service-oriented team, customer-centric, if you will, focused teams? And the idea is break down all the silos that we used to have before: network, storage, hardware, data center facilities, application team, database team, middleware team, and all these various teams that could represent a major showstopper in achieving the results expected when you move into the cloud. So if you would think about your existing team, the team that is managing the infrastructure, and if you think about the new environment, the cloud team, are they completely separate in reality? No. Okay, those of you who have implemented cloud, how many of you have actually taken some of the existing infrastructure team and let them join the cloud infrastructure operations? And that's what I was expecting. It's not totally new team. It's simply a derivative of the existing infrastructure operations team, because they have been dealing with virtualization, they have been dealing with the hardware, maybe some additional roles and additional steps required to make it even smoother, but that's exactly the right beginning. And we create a more focused and separated duties-based team, so it is very much focused on the cloud operations or the cloud infrastructure operations. When we talk about cloud infrastructure, that means the virtualization piece, the network piece, the storage piece, the performance, the analysis. So we will see various roles, and we need to worry about all of these at once. And then we have another team that is completely focused on the service level or the service customer-facing services, such as any service that you would ever think about other than the cloud infrastructure services. Think of this as VApp services. This could be applied on regular services that you got in your IT organization, and that's why we're calling the whole thing as the service management team. So creating a separate focused team, one is on the service level and the other one is on the cloud infrastructure operations, will allow the teams to be more focused on their duties and also more integrated when it comes to the goals and objectives. And I'm going to come back to the customer relationship manager role that I have been talking about in the previous slide. Now this, from experience, has been, as a role, has been working well if it sits within the IT organization in that space, into the service management team or the tenant operations, and reporting to IT, but it is dotted line reporting to the business. Now, one of the interesting things that we had with the implementation of this is that customers have seen value in this, but the risk and the challenge was if that role goes too far into one of the directions. So let's say it belongs to IT, so naturally it's going to go too far, focusing on IT priorities and forgetting about some of the line of business priorities. And that's where it gets, scary. Why? Because that role then becomes back to IT, and the whole purpose of this role is to balance how do we satisfy both needs, the business line of business requirements as well as the IT requirements and IT goals, and how can we make both teams, successful. So there is some sort of cross-group or cross-functional communication and collaboration. And that should be enforced in such a way that, hey, we don't want to end up with another siloed team. One of the implementations we had in the past, a customer who implemented something called Center of Excellence to reflect this cloud infrastructure team. And guess what? They ended up with another team within another team, another siloed team within a number of other siloed teams, which made the problem even worse. The reason was that those barriers should be totally smashed and broken and removed by enforcing certain communication channels and I would say policies that, hey, we need to act as a one team. One of the examples that I always use, we always ask companies or organizations, are you service-oriented organization? And they say, yeah, we are. Now guess what? They are referring to their ITIL v3 implementation or ISO 20000 certification. We have process, incident management process, service desk, change management, config, SLM, capacity, you name it. And well, that's part of the picture, but it's not yet enough to prove that this organization is a service-oriented organization. Why? Because if you are a service-oriented organization, I need this to be reflected in your day-to-day behavior, in the way that you team up for services, in the way that you build your clients. Don't build them for storage and capacity and memory and servers and all these garbage technical language components. Build them for actual services they use. Speak the language that they speak. So the whole, part of the transformation is actually the cultural transformation, the mindset transformation, or the paradigm shift that you will have to do. And that's why we're referring to some of the roles that you will see within the cloud operating model is that we have to team up as a service. We have to think as a service. And that's why one of the best recommended practices that we have identified and successfully implemented is the identification of something called champions or representatives out of the functional teams. So for example, when you talk about cloud infrastructure team, other than the people responsible for the virtualization piece, I need a champion from the network group. I need a champion from the storage group. I need a champion from a security group. And they virtually become part of the cloud infrastructure team. Why is that? Because I cannot operate in another silo after all what we have talked about. We need to be sitting or standing on simply a flat space, piece of land. You can say that this is going to be our team, and the communication should be very smooth between all of us.
And what one of the key aspects to this that we have found is it's not enough to identify these champions. These champions still, let's just take, well, before I do that, anybody in here from the networking team or manage the networking team? Okay. Oh,
one.
I'm still going to use it as an example, sorry. Example being networking team. The champion for the networking team still is part of the networking team, but there, and this is critical because we've seen customers who failed who haven't done this, the critical aspect for these champions to really make this work is to change their MBOs or their annual review criteria. It's not enough to just say, you're interested, so now you're the champion from networking to the cloud infrastructure operations team, because there's no incentive for them to really actively embrace that role. So the real key is, and one of the real key takeaways from this for a lot of this is, you have to go in and change their MBOs or their annual review criteria. So they have to explicitly be incentivized for two things. One is to help make the cloud infrastructure operations team successful, and secondly, to act as an evangelist back into the networking team about what's going on with cloud, software defined data center, hybrid cloud operations. So without that incentive, the probability of success goes way down. I had a customer who implemented this. They implemented the champions. They came back several months later, though, and said, this just isn't working. It's just like Khalid said. It's just like we created another silo. There's really no better communication. And my first question was, well, did you modify the champions' MBOs? And the answer was no. So they modified the champions' MBOs, and lo and behold, suddenly that communication got much better because that individual or those individuals now were incentivized. Their annual performance was based on how successful that cloud infrastructure operations team was.
Right. This ties back to some historical activity within the operations. Do you remember the so-called operating level agreements, OLAs? How many of you have had real implementations for OLAs? Okay, very few. Were they successful? Some? Okay. Well, I know that a lot of people know about the SLAs, the service level agreements. OLAs are internal SLAs, if you will. Now, one of the reasons why, or I would say the key reason why they were always failing, because simply you had a guy sitting somewhere within the technical silos, downloaded an OLA template, wrote it on his terms, passed it to his manager. All of a sudden, they raised the flag, this is our OLA with the rest of the team. And simply it was a template and a signature, or a couple of signatures. Well, I think the resolution for this, I mean, what we're trying to do over here is some sort of an agreement between the internal teams and also the service management team. Think of it as, yeah, how can we make it work? And if those are not baked into the MBOs for the individuals who actually signed, or the teams who signed the OLAs or the agreements, then again, that will not work. So it's all about answering the question, what is in it for me? Why do I have to do this? And once those goals or the new operating model is actually translated into goals and objectives, and those are reflected into the reviews and the goals of the individuals, then, as Kevin mentioned, that people are or would do what they are incentivized to do. So with that, you might find yourself that, hey, we need a couple of more roles. And again, I'm not talking about individuals, I'm talking about roles. We're living in the virtualization, so think of these as hats, okay, that your individuals or people will wear. And when we talk about various roles, we're separating the two service-based teams, and one of them is the cloud infrastructure operations. And I would like to start with the cloud architect role, which is responsible for the overall architecture and design of the cloud and cloud resources, and setting up the architectural standards and measures for the entire cloud computing environment. Also, you would find such a role involved in, let's say, Tier 3 or Level 3 escalations, the most complicated issues that we need, hey, we need the architect to get involved into this. We got also the cloud administrator role, which is as a role responsible for the day-to-day administration of the cloud, the virtualization resources, for example, and the overall monitoring and the health of the cloud out of the day-to-day monitoring exercises. And also, that role gets into the support, if needed, also into the configuration and the compliance related tasks, supporting deployments. So let's say we need one more virtualized environment in one of the geographies, then you would get the cloud administrator involved into this. The cloud analyst is one of the new roles that we have introduced, and simply it's all evolving because of the notion of, hey, we need to be predictive, we need to be proactive, and we're expecting such a person is not only enough to look at the yellow, red, and green kind of indicators. We need more skilled individual who looks into the events and the issues and finds solutions before they even happen or occur as issues or incidents. This role might be specialized in, let's say, capacity-related issues or performance-related analysis or security-related concerns, or dealing with the incidents and trying to go through the root cause analysis and trying to prevent them from happening in the future. So it's more of a proactive approach, reaching out to the cloud operation environment and building some sort of self-learning or auto-remediation environment for the incidents that might happen in the future. We also got the cloud developer role, which is another new role that is introduced in the cloud environment. Now, one might think, well, yeah, we need this role to create us the workflows and the custom scripts to enable more effective automation. That is true. However, someone might say, well, we already got that. We have a couple of developers. They would help us in building those. Well, guess what? One script from the right and another script from another individual, and you come up with a collection of scripts and workflows. What if those individuals leave the company or leave the team? What do? You might not be following a full structured approach like a software development lifecycle approach in building the required workflows and custom scripts, and therefore you need a more of dedicated role towards the integration and automation, building up the library of the workflows and scripts that you need to make this cloud environment in fully automated mode. On the service management team, we got the service portfolio manager as one of the important roles. And you could think of this role as the service broker role. I mean, if we want to think of an organization to be a service brokerage organization, centralizing all the requests and having a personal role to going through all the requests, making sure that they understand what the business wants, and probably forwarding some of them to the business analysts. So that role would also be responsible for digging down into the details and checking maybe outside market who can kind of deliver those types of services instead of having IT, for example, involved. So service portfolio manager is actually responsible for building out the overall IT service portfolio, along with the service catalog establishment. And you will see another role called service administrator, who takes care of the day-to-day activities for a service catalog. We also got the customer relationship manager role that we talked about. And we also got the service owner. How many of you have implemented a role called service manager or service owner? Okay. So you are somewhere within the transformation program, I would say. Well, that's a big evidence that, hey, we got some service owners, in the picture. The way I look at a completely service-oriented organization is just like when you have in a manufacturing organization, you have got products being produced by the end of the day. And for those products, you got a product manager, and you got finance, you got sales, you got marketing, right? Why don't we think the same way for IT? The underlying picture doesn't change. You will still have developers, you will still have operations, you will still have databases and infrastructure, but the top layer should be a business-oriented layer. We produce services. We are a service provider. So we should have a way to promote these services. That's marketing. We should have a way to, sell those if we're talking about like chargeback or even just a cross-charge or showback. We should have a way to demonstrate the value of all of these services. So think of it that you're running a real business. And that's the difference between a completely technology-driven IT organization and a business-driven IT organization. That's where you see the service owner, like the product manager, gets involved because he or she owns the service that they are managing on a day-to-day basis. We also got the service architect. So like a cloud architect, the service architect is responsible at the service level responsible for architecting generally the services that run at the service level. So it has got nothing to do with the underlying cloud infrastructure components. We talk about integration with applications. We talk about integration with outside components. We talk about how much of capacity we need out of the cloud infrastructure operations to make it available. And we also get the the service developer. A service developer is a role that mostly works with the application development team to help them and guide them on how to create cloud-aware applications. What is it from an operational perspective? What is it required that they need to build in or bake in during the time of development so that the operation of that application or service becomes smoother while it is on the cloud? Service analyst, again, would be a role concerned about the performance and the capacity, the security, the configuration, and the compliance areas, but at the service level, not at the component or cloud infrastructure resources levels. And finally, the service administrator. Think of the service administrator as the person or the role responsible for setting up the blueprints, managing the service catalog entries within the cloud services, being on top of the issues on day-to-day basis, monitoring the health of the cloud services on continuous basis. So this certainly requires some sort of interaction, some level of interaction between the teams. And we're bringing this slide just to show a couple of examples. So for example, between the cloud infrastructure operations team that is focused on the cloud and also the cloud tenant operations. Let's take as an example level 3 support required. One of the services is suffering because of a cloud infrastructure component. So the cloud tenant operations calls or escalates the case to cloud infrastructure operations that, hey, we need the help and support regarding this. Or even vice versa. If, let's say, a component is being overutilized for some reason or overloaded because of a service-related issue. And the same thing happens at the service development level, where you get related support-related issues or more operational guidance from the cloud infrastructure operations to the cloud tenant operations. The second type of interaction is between the cloud tenant operations and the application development. Think of it this way. How would you guide, as a service management team, how would you guide your application development team to, A, bake in all the operational best practices into their applications that they develop to make their applications aware of the cloud and how the cloud will support, or how their application will support, for example, elasticity and the agility? I mean, typically application developers would create their stuff in an isolated environment, and maybe the vision is to have the cloud platform to be the predominant platform in the future. So everything is going to be hosted into our private cloud. So all the applications would one day might be running on the cloud, the private cloud or the SDDC. Also, we got the escalation side of the house, where we have an issue within an application that is caused by a service or vice versa. So there is a lot of interaction between these different groups. And like Kevin mentioned, that the best way to shape the interaction by having those requirements programmed into the individual's MBOs so that they are, encouraged to work together as one team and at the end of the day become a service-oriented team. So this is one of the examples, the tenant operations or the service management team, well, in the previous slide, we were talking about the tenant operations, the service management layer. But guess what? It could inflate and create or have more one tenant operations team across the line of businesses, if it makes sense at all. So, for example, we have a central tenant operations that sits within the enterprise group, but we might have partial roles that represent the tenant operations into line of business, say 1 and 2 and 3. But line of business 4 will use all the services provisioned by the same group from the enterprise team. What I'm saying is that the intention is to capture the business requirements and to be able to help and support the line of businesses to achieve their objectives the way that it makes sense. So if it makes sense to have certain representatives from the tenant operations in certain line of businesses, that's absolutely fine.
And I'm just going to bring up one example here. This is exactly how we've done it within VMware. VMware implemented a global tenant operations, but some of our larger lines of business, like Edu, has sufficient number of services and rate of change within those services that it warranted them having their own version of tenant ops to support them exclusively. And then that tenant ops interacts with the global tenant ops if there is something where some infrastructure is affected. So that global tenant ops remains as the primary point of contact with infrastructure ops, but you can have these tenant ops within lines of business if that line of business, their number of services, rate of change dictate that. Or you might have a subset of tenant ops. It's not unusual for us to work with a customer where we can easily justify having a line of business have their own service architect and service developer, for instance, because they take the infrastructure as a service provided as a service by the global tenant ops, and then they layer line of business specific applications, development platforms, whatever it might be, into those infrastructure as a service resources that were delivered, that they provisioned.
So the last thing I want to talk about is what it takes this to change. Yeah, we're going to come to the questions. What does it take for the whole thing to be, changing, and what is it that we will see from obstacles point of view? Well, first of all, we need to address a cultural change. So moving from a cost center to a value creator center, moving from a passive order taker to a more proactive IT organization. There could be several approaches on how we achieve this. One of the approaches could be using the one bang approach and say, well, from the next month, we're going to adopt the cloud, and based on this, we will have these roles, and these are the changes, so everything has been enforced. Guess what? Probably several months down the road, you will see probably a good percentage of OPEX, operational expenses savings, because of the attrition has been impacted, and you have some people who left their roles because of this. Well, this is the extreme of it, because people were not willing to adopt the change. People were not willing to take the new responsibilities and embrace the change in a more positive way. But the other approach could be where you can say, well, we're going to implement some of these roles, and we're going to train you based on the gap analysis that we have figured out, and based on this, your objectives from, say, today until the next 6 months to achieve 1, 2, 3, these are your goals, and you take them through gradual approach, which is definitely something that we recommend. But sometimes some organizations or individuals within organizations might have that approach more effective, the one that I talked about first. Communication is a key piece. So typically one of the biggest issues always popping up into or acting as showstopper when it comes to the operation excellence is things that are not communicated in a clear manner. Communication of goals, communication of where we want to go, communication of what your role and your responsibilities should be. Even when we talk about baking into these changes into the MBOs and goals, these need to be communicated in a broader sense. Okay? Enablement, training, process enablement, technology enablement is definitely one of the biggest necessities. And finally, the motivation. Again, we have to be able to answer the question, what's in it for me? As an individual, as a manager. Would you inspire your team members to move from their current roles to probably a more exciting roles, even for their career? So that's the point where you need to think about. And also the goals and objectives. Remember one thing that I truly believe in. Performance metrics truly impact the behaviors. So as a manager or as a team group leader, designing your metrics and MBOs in such a way that will eventually change the behavior of the individuals. Kevin?
Yep. So I'm going to finish this off. I know we're down to about 5 minutes, so I just have one slide, and I'm just going to go ahead and build it out real quick. What I want to talk about on this real quickly is the impact of scale and software-defined data center and all this. So I hate to sound like a consultant, though I was for a very long time, but everything we've talked about is a model, but it really, how it's implemented depends on your environment. There is no, there are certainly rules of thumb, but there is no prescriptive checklist that you can go through that if you do this, it's guaranteed to work in every situation for every single organization. So implementation does vary. Your mileage does vary, if you will, depending on the organization, its culture, what it's trying to achieve, its strategic goals. Secondly, consolidation to specialization. We talked about creating a consolidated team that's focused in on cloud infrastructure operations or tenant operations. As you scale out, when you start out, if you start out small, those could be generalist. We had, let's say, on the cloud infrastructure ops side, we had 4 or 5 roles defined. Those could be filled by just a couple of people potentially initially. So they could be generalist. What we found is certainly as it scales out, very likely those generalists aren't no longer going to be sufficient because of scale, and you will see a re-specialization, if you will, especially in that analyst role. So it may start out as a generalist who is very good with the VC Ops suite, for instance, but over time, due to scale and rate of change and incoming requirements from customers, that undoubtedly is going to, as we've seen, is going to start splitting back out to specialties, whether it be a capacity analyst, performance analyst, whatever the case may be. So that's something else to expect. And lastly, redefining roles even further. That's really referring to that software-defined data center. And specifically network virtualization and storage virtualization. Network virtualization is going to change the way networking is done, and the skills to do network virtualization are quite different from those required to do physical networking, for instance. So as you implement network virtualization, it's a very logical step to have that individual perhaps come out of the networking team, but become a permanent member of that cloud infrastructure operations, which may not be needed, or probably isn't needed, if you are still using a physical network infrastructure. But once you go to network virtualization, that needs to shift, and there needs to be someone responsible for that is part of that cloud infrastructure ops. So just real quick in closing, I'm basically going to repeat what I started out by saying. The business as usual has changed, but transforming will yield demonstrable results, as we've seen through our journey study. The operating model needs to change, as you saw from our earlier slides, which in turn impacts the organization based on our recommendations that we have found to work very well in creating those infrastructure operations team, and especially that tenant operations team. But the challenges that present themselves can be overcome. So there is hope. And with that, I'm going to leave it up on this slide. There we go. Okay, now I'm going to leave it on this slide. For the couple minutes we have left, if there's any questions, this is just if you want more information. These are the various resources we have available from blog, et cetera, et cetera. There is a white paper on organizing for the cloud. I happen to write that, but that's a white paper that's available as well that goes into a lot of detail on this. So any questions real quick? We'll be around afterwards because I know we ran out of time. I apologize for that, and I promised I wouldn't keep you from the drinks. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you.
If you do want to dive into this any deeper, I have a group discussion session tomorrow specifically around organization and operational considerations. That's more of a discussion environment. So, please attend if you want to dive into this any deeper. And don't forget your survey. Please. I won't.